Hello and welcome to the cesspool, and more importantly, welcome to Committed, the series that gives me the excuse to talk about one of my own guilty pleasures, old psychiatric hospitals. I know this is a huge step away from the usual content here on the cesspool, but please just give it a try and you might just like it. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to everybody who has been so supportive of this series. It really does mean the world to me that there are people finding these videos and hopefully learning a little along the way. It's a topic that I've always thought was incredibly obscure, and to see people comment and actually like the videos really does make my day. I know I've been away from this series for a while, but life gets in the way. Anyway, though, I'm excited to tell you another story, and hopefully many more in the future. Again, thank you, and enjoy the video. Today's story takes us to the lush green hills of northwestern New Jersey, specifically the town of Morris Plains in Morris County. Although only incorporated as recently as 1926, the village of Morris Plains dates back to the early colonial times, with the first settlers coming in 1685. The village has always been a quaint and quiet farming community until the Morristown and Essex Railroad, later part of the larger Lackawanna Railroad, stormed through the small community. With that, the town began to grow at a much more rapid pace. Meanwhile, at the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton, the state was realizing quickly that their once revolutionary and sprawling facility, which had opened in 1848, was becoming inadequate both in location and number of beds for the growing population of the state. Dorothy Dix, a well-known advocate for the treatment of mental illness and a major player in the construction of Trenton State Hospital, was lobbying for a new facility to take the pressure off of Trenton. The state recognized the emerging population centers in Morristown, Parsippany, and Newark, and with that in mind chose an empty hillside overlooking the community of Morris Plains in 1875 to construct a truly monstrous new hospital. They invested $2.5 million into obtaining 743 acres of land and named their new hospital to be the State Asylum for the Insane at Morristown. It would serve the 8 northern communities of the state, while the Trenton facility served the southern 13. The state chose architect Samuel Sloan to design their state-of-the-art building. However, the team was not yet fully assembled. Following the Kirkbride plan for the layout of the building, Sloan enlisted the help of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride himself, along with Trenton State Hospital superintendent and longtime friend of Dr. Kirkbride, Horace Butliff. Together, they would design a building so impressive and so large in its footprint at 673,706 square feet that it would not be surpassed in size until 1943, the construction of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The building was not only massive, but also beautiful, following the Second Empire style of high Victorian architecture. It featured a mansard roof, locally cut stone for its walls, and an unbelievable amount of small ornate details. Of course, the structure followed the typical trends of the Kirkbride plan. It had a central administration building with winged wards positioned further out and backwards. It was well lit and well ventilated, as was standard in the design as well. Opened on August 14, 1876, the State Asylum for the Insane at Morristown initially inherited 292 patients from Trenton. This was its primary purpose. However, the institution was designed to care for 600 patients comfortably, intended to be filled by patients of the region it primarily served. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment to explain that throughout its existence, the hospital would go by many names, as was standard for these facilities. However, the most well-known and longest-lasting of these names was Greystone Park, so for the duration of the videos, I will be referring to it by Greystone Park. Anyway, with its focus on the more populated northern communities of the state, Greystone's population grew immensely just in its first few years of operation. Each ward was initially designed to have 20 patients each. They were beautifully furnished with wool rugs, parlors, dining rooms, and many other state-of-the-art amenities of the time. During these early years, the hospital was a shining example of moral treatment, even with its very large patient population. Of course, by following the Kirkbride plan, it was believed that the building and the grounds would have curative properties. However, other types of treatment were employed. Patients were encouraged to work and be productive, whether that be on the hospital's farms or making crafts and products. This was known as occupational treatment and was mainstay in many Kirkbride institutions. Now, Greystone wasn't just a place for the committed in its early years, however. It also accepted payment from more wealthy people at the time just to rent out private spaces on the property. These people would use the hospital's beautiful structures and surroundings as a kind of relaxing vacation destination. Ultimately, though, this was a short-lived business venture as the patient population of the hospital began to explode over the years. By 1895, the hospital was operating well over its intended capacity, with a population of over 900 patients. The beautifully furnished interiors began to be replaced by desperately needed beds and cots. The building started to lose its shine and cleanliness. An outbreak of typhoid fever rocked the institution the same year, ultimately sourcing from the hospital's water supply. The administration knew they needed to do something, and fast, before the situation started to roll out of control. Their solution, the construction of a large building they referred to as the Dormitory building in 1901. This was a huge relief to the Kirkbride, which was ready to burst at the seams. It was designed in a similar architectural style to the Kirkbride, as well as used similar local materials. The design was more modern, following the pavilion plan instead of the Kirkbride plan. It included patient wards as well as medical facilities such as operating rooms and infirmaries. There was even a bowling alley constructed in the building to give patients activities to do during the snowy and colder winters. This building allowed the hospital to once again begin to treat patients more individually and utilize the methods of occupational treatment more efficiently. To the administration, the building was a huge success. However, even with this new building, as the population continued to tick upwards, the hospital would find itself in the same situation it did only a few short years later. In 1903, Greystone surpassed 1,500 patients. The dormitory building, which only a couple years earlier looked like a great solution to their problem, was clearly not going to do the job. During this time, the hospital began to shift some of its focus from just moral and occupational treatment to more direct approaches. Hydrotherapy baths were installed in the dormitory building, and in 1906, the first electroshock therapy machine was installed in the Kirkbride. For the next 2 decades, the hospital would continue its battle with overcrowding as the population of New Jersey continued to rise. After the First World War, the hospital would set aside sections of the Kirkbride for veterans suffering from mental illness. In most cases, this was shell shock, or later known as PTSD, and it would be decades before it would be recognized as such. In the 1920s, many major changes were made to Greystone. Annexes were built into the dormitory building to increase population, and the clinical building was constructed in 1923. This structure was designed specifically for medical purposes and freed up space inside the dormitory building previously used for such activities. The Voorhees and night cottages were also constructed for staff on the property to give more space inside the main structures during this time. Towards the latter half of the decade, the Curry Reception Building was constructed in honor of the hospital's medical director, Dr. Marcus Curry. In 1924, Greystone was given its most well-known name, the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. With all the improvements the hospital was attempting to make during the early decades of the 20th century, there were some serious issues that also arose. The most obvious being the extreme cruelty that came with hydrotherapy as well as electroshock therapy. Unfortunately, the doctors during this period truly believed that they would be beneficial, and it wouldn't be until decades later that they would be considered barbaric. The patient population, although trying to be put under control, was still very overcrowded in the existing structures. In 1911 alone, there was 2,672 patients. This number did nothing but increase as the years rolled on. The administration at Greystone was also facing a serious issue. The board of directors was dealing with corruption as they began to appoint high-ranking officials based on political connections instead of qualifications for the job at hand. This included the superintendent position. The issues of the 1920s culminated in a chaotic conclusion, however. The Kirkbride suffered 3 fires between 1929 and 1930, the final and most devastating of which occurred on November 26, 1930. It completely incapacitated large portions of the Kirkbride and forced the hospital to do a major reconstruction of the upper floors of the building. It was determined that faulty wiring on the 6th floor of the tower was the cause of the fire. This created a serious problem. While the Kirkbride was being repaired, hundreds of patients needed to be transferred to a different location as the building was considered unsafe. At this point, even the state of New Jersey had sat up and taken notice of how serious the situation at Greystone had become. In reaction to the displaced patients caused by the November 26th fire, the state hastily opened the Marlborough Psychiatric Hospital in 1931. Unfortunately for Greystone, this created a new issue. For patients to be accepted into Marlborough, they needed to pass a test. This caused all of the more physically and mentally fit patients to be sent to Marlborough and forced Greystone to care for the more seriously ill and weak. As a result, the extensive occupational treatments that Greystone had set up as part of their infrastructure, including the massive farm on the property, could not be properly maintained. Luckily, the institution was able to catch a break when FDR's Work Progress Administration, as a part of the New Deal, gave the hospitals additional workers to fill the positions left by the patients who were sent to Marlborough. With time, the Kirkbride was repaired and reopened. However, the building had lost its beautiful mansard roof, as well as its more detailed ironwork. What it lost in beauty, however, it did gain in utility. The structure gained another full floor, which allowed for a larger capacity, something that was a constant battle. Greystone did make a very important decision during this period that showed the character of the administration at the time. In the 1940s, the lobotomy was starting to emerge as a new and effective method to treat the mentally ill. Of course, today we know it is the most cruel and damaging treatment a hospital could give. However, at the time, it was seen as quote-unquote revolutionary to many mental institutions. However, Columbia University and Greystone Park decided to challenge that notion. While Greystone had performed the lobotomies before this, they worked with Columbia to create a study of the effects of the treatment. Columbia ultimately concluded what we all believe today. The practice was truly barbaric and inhumane. It didn't help the patients at all, and the practice needed to be ended immediately. Although this was a very forward-thinking idea, the practice unfortunately continued to remain prevalent through the next decade at most mental institutions. As the decades wore on, Greystone continued to become an overcrowded and out-of-control institution, in line with many others like it across the country. After the Second World War, much like the First, many veterans were sent to Greystone suffering from PTSD. As Greystone was one of the few facilities capable of treating this, it greatly increased the hospital's overall population. The peak population arrived in 1953, with 7,674 patients admitted to the hospital. Through the 50s and into the 60s, new forms of mental treatment were beginning to emerge. Drugs and outpatient programs were beginning to prevail as more practical and effective methods. As a result, it was less necessary for people suffering from mental illnesses to be admitted long-term into psychiatric hospitals. The development of Thorazine in particular spearheaded this change. By the 1970s and 80s, deinstitutionalization was occurring across the country, and the population of state-run psychiatric hospitals were decreasing quickly. Greystone was no different. A very important moment in Greystone's history came in 1977 with the Doe versus Klein case. The prosecution argued that Greystone was not providing patients with decent living conditions and abusing its patients. The result of the case was that a watch group made of volunteers would supervise the hospital to make sure that patients were being treated fairly and humanely. This also called for patients to receive better housing, as the Kirkbride and its many sister buildings had been worn down from their decades and decades of use. The hospital constructed over 20 independent living structures to house the patients throughout the 1980s, slowly emptying the Kirkbride in the process. By 1988, the wings of the massive structure were completely empty. However, like many Kirkbrides, the administration building continued to operate independently and was not affected by the closure of the wings. The 90s, even with the advent of the watch group, was a very difficult era for Greystone. The scarred institution suffered from many patient escapes and suicides. The hospital staff was accused of abuse and rape. Some female patients were even found to be pregnant. Although for the institution this was a very hard time, it was the time where its preservation movement was beginning to sprout up. Students from Drew University, located in Madison, New Jersey, were the first to submit the proposal for the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital to be placed on the National Register of Historical Places. Unfortunately, this proposal was turned down as they did not have enough evidence to support their argument outside of the Kirkbride building. These students were forward-thinking, and soon enough their preservationist ideas would become much more widespread. As the new millennia pushed in, Greystone was suffering. The facility was now only suited for 550 beds, less than the institution had initially been designed for back in 1876. Much of the hospital campus was old and dilapidated, and the state recognized this, and a study was conducted to determine how to proceed with upgrading the facility. The buildings had outlived their useful lives, and the state ordered the hospital to be consolidated into a new 450-bed structure that would be completely state-of-the-art. Greystone was ordered to be closed by Governor Christine Todd Whitman in 2000. Major structures on the property would be demolished over the following years, including the dormitory buildings, the Curry complex, and the medical buildings. In 2005, 300 acres of the Greystone property was sold to the town of Morris Plains. They would remove the asbestos from their sites and clean the properties up. A law was passed during this period to ensure the natural beauty of the property would remain in place by banning new development on the entire Kirkbride property. In 2005, the New Jersey Healthcare Facilities Financing Authority closed a $186,565,000 bond issued on behalf of the state of New Jersey Department of Human Services. This money would be used for the construction of the brand new Greystone Park Psychiatric Center. Within 2 months of gaining that money, the state broke ground on the new construction. This new building was not far from the existing structure, being situated about 2,000 feet behind the Kirkbride. Despite the governor's orders to close Greystone within 3 years, the facility chugged along past that sell-by date, as there were multiple delays regarding the new facility. However, the day of reckoning for the battered and beaten Greystone came on July 16, 2008, when a brand new facility opened its doors. Patients were quickly transferred from the aging structures of the old campus into the sleek and modern interiors of the new buildings. Shortly after, the administration began to pack their own things and say their last goodbyes to the Kirkbride as they relocated to the new structure. By the end of the year, the original Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital was quiet and devoid of life. So this is where the story truly picks up and starts to get strange. If you thought the last 16 minutes was a wild ride, buckle up because it's just getting started. Now, for several years following the opening of the new Greystone structure, the original building was left to the elements. It was boarded up to prevent trespassers, but little else was done to preserve it. The state didn't really seem to know what they wanted to do with the building, as was recognized in the original report done back in 1999 to determine the fate of the complex by the Whitman administration. The Kirkbride was specifically mentioned to be spared from the wrecking ball, considering its historical significance. For several years, it seemed like that was the intent of the state, as there were no immediate plans for demolition following the opening of the new hospital. Concerned citizens and historians did begin to recognize the deterioration of the Kirkbride and the surrounding property, especially with the advent of the new facility opening. As a result, Preserve Greystone was founded in 2008 with the simple goal of preserving the Kirkbride and the surrounding property. The state of New Jersey cycled through several governors during the 2000s, and while there was always the thought of demolition, nothing really seemed to threaten the Kirkbride other than the weather battering its old roof. Everything changed, however, as the new decade moved in and New Jersey elected its 55th governor, Chris Christie. Now, this is a man who is very divisive, particularly in New Jersey, so I will leave politics out as much as I can, but unfortunately they do play into this story. So in 2013, with the state clearly becoming desperate for some action to be taken at the old Greystone campus, there was a solicitation put out to developers to submit plans for the property. Several developers submitted plans, and several of them had millions of dollars backing them. They wanted to preserve the Kirkbride and revitalize the area by reusing the unique structures. They even offered that their projects would be of no cost to the state. By early 2014, the state had rejected every single one of the proposals and announced that demolition plans were being drawn up. Preservationists, especially Preserve Greystone, were dumbfounded and furious with this announcement. They would repeatedly inquire to the state about the reasons behind their actions, to no response. They asked any official they could, including the governor himself, whether they would even consider rethinking their decision, and they would always get a one-word response: no. As the demolition loomed near, more information began to be revealed about the plan. North Star Contracting, a company based out of East Hanover, New York, would be awarded the contract for the demolition. The state was essentially spending $34.4 million of the taxpayers' money for something that an increasing number of the taxpayers didn't want and far too many didn't even know about. Demolition on the Greystone campus began on April 6, 2015. As the building slowly began to fall to the wrecking ball, there were frequent protests at the Kirkbride building. Signs and posters were put up on the fence surrounding the building begging for the demolition to halt. However, it seemed like time was running out for the Kirkbride. The Christie administration wanted the building gone quickly, as the utilities of upkeeping the aging building's security and maintenance was $1.8 million a year. However, it was clear the backlash they were receiving was beginning to be a PR nightmare for a state government that was already not favored by the majority of its own people. The first to fall was the female wing, beginning with the violent wards and moving forward towards the administration building. Soon after, the male wings began to disappear as well. Now, while these protests were occurring on site and demolition continued, Preserve Greystone was taking legal approaches to preserving the building. They went to court several times, arguing that the state had violated New Jersey's Historic Places Act since it had not gotten the proper DEP approval for the demolition. They appealed this case several times, but to no avail. All the while, the building was shrinking in size and time was running out. The public in New Jersey was making such an outcry regarding the demolition that the story had spread to a national level. People across the country began to hold protests at their own local Kirkbride hospital to try to deter Greystone's fate. The media was beginning to pick up on the story as well, spreading the word even further. With the Kirkbride having lost its wings by the fall of 2015, preservationists tried desperately to save what remained of the building, hoping to save the most iconic portion of the Greystone Kirkbride, the Administration Building. Its beautifully constructed tower stood alone as a final and most important piece of Greystone. It had symbolized the hospital through its entire history, and now it was all that remained. Preservationists knew they needed to save this building at all costs. The state had no such plans. On October 14th, 2015, the tower fell. Not long after, the building and its almost 140 years of history was gone. By February of the next year, the building had been replaced with a flat plot of land and given to Morris County. Preserve Greystone, knowing their fight was over, had dissolved as an organization on July 9th, 2015. However, to try to keep the movement of preservation alive, they transferred their nonprofit status to Preservation Works, which was a startup organization with the mission to help preserve Kirkbride hospitals across the country. Many people from Preserve Greystone, including the founder and spokesperson, now work with Preservation Works. Following all the backlash from the demolition, the state did promise to build a memorial to the hospital on site. So now, at the end of 2021, it has been over 6 years since the last bits of Greystone have fallen. What use has come of this massive plot of land, you may ask? Well, nothing. Today the property is an empty street leading to an empty plot of land, still scarred by the shape of what used to stand on its grounds. The state has not built a memorial or any sort of recognition of Greystone. We lost a massive historical landmark for nothing. Of course, this isn't the first time Kirkbride hospitals have been lost to demolition dozens of times before, but never had there been such a movement to save one of these places. And that makes you wonder, what set Greystone apart from all the others? What made it so special to garner all this attention? Perhaps its history, maybe the imposing architecture and size? Could it be the potential of renovation and development? Honestly, there is no clear answer. What people don't realize about these buildings is that they become staples of communities. They, for better or for worse, are woven into the history of the towns that have hosted them for a century or more. They are a constant in that small town or city, always there with a story to tell, whether good or bad. But then, when that constant is threatened to be taken away, communities fight to keep it. Greystone was simply the poster child for the preservation movement at these facilities. The threat of its demolition came at a time when people were finally starting to realize the value of these buildings and the stories that would be lost with their demolition. It's impossible to run from the past, whether an edifice of that past is standing or not. All we can do is try to make sure that the future is better by learning from that past. Thank you all, from the bottom of my heart, for watching. Committed is a series that I have made simply because I find it to be a fulfilling pastime. Unfortunately, that also means that when other things in life get in the way, it is put on the back burner, so I hope that in the end it was worth the wait. I'm so proud of everything this cesspool has grown into this year, and hope that next year we grow even more. So Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year from the cesspool to everybody watching. I know this isn't really a Christmas-themed video, but I just thought it would be our little gift to the infinite sea that is the internet. And with all of that said and done, I don't know when the next video will be, but I'll see you guys then, and happy holidays.